later in science, we're going to come up to using a pair of books. One of them is the Molecular Biology of the Cell. It has 6 authors. One of the most formative authors there is James D. Watson. And Watson, along with Francis Crick, were the discoverers of the double helix structure of DNA, Watson and Crick, and they won the Nobel Prize for that. And Crick was a mad Englishman, and Watson was an insane American. And when they made a film of the double helix, the only actor they could find to accurately portray Watson's character was Jeff Goldblum. And we have a video of that film, The Search for the Double Helix, here, and you can see his character. He was in a rush to discover the structure of DNA so he could pursue girls. He wanted more spare time for this. Along with Watson's et al., Molecular Biology of the Gene, which is an advance over the double helix. And if you remember, we used the double helix in Nature 2 years ago. So in a way, Watson's 2 books are a way to index and gauge the tremendous distance that we have come and the tremendous jump, not just a jump from one level to another, but the jump has to be indexed in terms of a whole key, so that we have not jumped one level, but we have jumped an entire key. It is a very powerful idea, and those who are musically informed will appreciate this. In our standard notation, developed over several thousand years, a musical key has 8 notes in it. Those 8 notes are called an octave, and that octave is a vibrational sequence. And at a certain periodicity, the entire sequence jumps to another key. Let's say it again, because it's very powerful. When you move from one note to another, there is quite a difference. For instance, do, re, mi, fa, so. You can hear the distinction between notes. But the distinction between keys is a whole different ordering. When you jump from one key to another, the entire octave has jumped. Let's say it again. We're talking here about a universal characteristic of reality. If one wants to be Hegelian and you want to say, well, what is the ultimate real? The ultimate real has no quality, no property whatsoever. It's just simply Tao. And one can't even label it Tao because there's nothing to label. And there's no one to make the label, and there's no label. But as soon as there is movement, there is Te. Tao is Te when it moves. When movement stills itself, ultimately, Te is Tao. It's pedestrian to say that they're the same thing because the same thing, that language, in order to carry meaning, has an image substrate which works on the idea of identity And the relationality of Tao and Te, of movement and absolute stillness, is deeper than identity. So one has to watch out for a very superficial glossing over and missing the meaning. Not just the implications, not just the deductions, but the actuality and the way in which the actuality has its veracity. It is the reductive, ignorant mind that believes that causality must be the way in which the universe works. It cannot work that way. In all deep, honest realization, it is, to use Richard Nixon's famous phrase, it is perfectly clear that causality is not what's happening. And to term what is happening acausal, as someone like Carl Jung would do, is deceptive. It's neither causal nor acausal. The acausality language and concept takes advantage of the same substrate of identification, which in all truth is non-operable. Well, then how do we talk? If we're not going to be able to say that it's causal or it's acausal, that it's causal or synchronistic, how are we going to talk? We have to use terms which unfortunately have tended to be beggared over the last 100 years by metaphysics. We have to use terms like vibration, vibes. We have to use terms like frequency, and we have to bring in correlative words like oscillation. And these kinds of words all can be harbored under a very powerful idea, the idea of consonance. That vibration and oscillation and frequency index by a term resonance, and that resonance is patterned by an idea which we give it the name consonance. And that the operation of a consonance substrate, not identity, but a consonance substrate, precludes both synchronicity and causality as operative principle. And that the operative quality of a consonance is that there is always then some detectable harmonic. The language works beautifully in this way. So that in talking almost in musical terms with a touch, a tinge of metaphysical associative qualities, is a very good language. But it's difficult, extremely difficult to talk this way without sliding off into metaphysics or without stepping up into musicality. And the musicality has some difficulties that are there simply because of the last 200 years of history of music theory and development have been influenced by what we would call romantic transcendental idealism, which has many excellent qualities, but which has some shall we say, negative mental feedback. So when one looks to try to use a model for the universe, a mature, grown-up, scientific, conscious model for the universe, about 50 years ago, many intelligent men and women on this planet began to use musical, philosophical language to expressively convey what it was that they were being able to envision. Two examples. In 1945, one of the greatest of all 20th century philosophy books was published. The author was a woman, Susanne Langer. And Susanne Langer, who had studied with Ernst Cassirer and Alfred North Whitehead, two of the greatest minds of the 20th century, had put them together. When you put two powerful vectors together, and a powerful mind with its style, its personal verve and everything, becomes in the movement, the te of the universe, like a vector. And when you have two vectors that come together, you always get a third resultant. And the resultant, instead of being a vector in itself, is mathematically called a tensor, which has many interesting properties and many interesting characteristics, and which can be used consciously to investigate all kinds of indexing accuracy. And so Susanne Langer was a tensor of Ernst Cassirer's great penetration into symbolic forms. His great work was in 3 volumes, The Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. And Alfred North Whitehead, who was one of the greatest logicians of the 20th century, was the co-author with Bertrand Russell of Principia Mathematica, that simply shifted the foundations of mathematics and showed that mathematical structure and logical structure were the same structure, functioning in different language expressive modes, but carrying the same meaningfulness. So Susanne Langer, a tremendously important woman, took these two vectors and she wrote a book published by Harvard University Press, 1945, one of our textbooks. And what was its title? Philosophy in a New Key. That we're not jumping a note. It's not a different note. It's a whole different key. The entire octave has jumped. It's in a different key. So that every notation is going to carry the new key. And in order to play it right, in order to hum along with it, you have to be able to follow jumps in keys, which means then that you have to be acquainted with the musical scale. Because while notes are grouped by a key, the keys are grouped by a scale. And a scale is a universal form. Now one can use a term, I'm not going to bring it in too strongly here because it does get confusing, but in modern mathematics, in modern physics, modern meaning 1990s, one would have to go to a theoretical construct where you bring gauge theory in to deal with the harmonics of scales and the ways in which that dimension of grouping functions in such a way that the specificity is startling. The new mysticism is not a mysticism of not knowing, but it's a mysticism of knowing so precisely that one is stunned by the accuracy. The old medieval notion of a mystic as someone who is otherworldly in a kind of a dreamer sense is completely vanished. That's an old movie role. The 21st century mystic is astounding because of the precision everywhere where reality operates. Wherever Tay is, the new mystic is there so precisely that you can't write enough zeros. One uses a standard scale like 10 to the 42nd, which happens to be a universal scale dealing with the formation of the tensor between hydrogen and oxygen vectors into something called water. And the number of atoms in the universe and the number of expansions available through the permutations of Waters gauging 10 to the 42nd turns out to be a rather interesting number. Now, when you try to write all those zeros, it's long. I'd love to have a new badge with 10 to the 42nd with all the zeros, and you wear it like a military braid. What's your political party? 10 to the 42nd. Yeah. Where are we at? Where have we got to? We've got to a deep insight. Now, an insight is like a note. Do, another insight, re, another insight, mi. Insights are not just accidental. If one is acquainted with a gauge field of reality, insights can be recognized that this insight is such and such a note, and it belongs in such and such an octave. And that there are different happenings, so much more major than insights, that it's a shift to a new key. So that while it's startling that all insights are recognizable as having an exactness, a specificity, a conscious scientific yogi can detect the difference between insights instantly, and you can be taught that. But beyond the surprise that happens is the corollary surprise that they group into octaves, and the tertiary surprise that those octaves jump key and that there are higher keys. And that they jump, that while the octave is maintained by symbolic structures, the jump in keys is due to envisioning processes. And the comprehension of the entire scale is what the mature spiritual person is all about. The mature spiritual person is a singular expression of the entire scale of the real. We're not talking about a well-adjusted 9-to-5er who pays his mortgages and doesn't divorce his kids. We're not talking about that level. We're not talking about being adjusted to sociological bumps. We're talking about someone who's at home in the universe. that person can emerge from an education. So the criticism that an education like this is kind of iffy because you don't get a degree, I'm sorry, but you've got it completely wrong. If you're going to school to get a degree, you're so completely baffled by sociological mumbo-jumbo that you don't even get the one single note insight that there's something possible other than this, much less the jump to a new key, much less the comprehension of the scale. Now, in all of this, in this science, in this maturity, in this high-powered consciousness, which so many people opt themselves out for whatever reasons, it doesn't matter. The reasons are extraneous, but opting out at this particular juncture simply means that you haven't been here. Because this is about something that is indelibly real. It doesn't matter where you're going to go or who you are. This particular threshold has to be crossed sooner or later. And that's why the yogi traditionally could hold up in the ashram, up in the Himalayas. You don't have to be on Main Street in whatever particular burg of whatever civilization is going on, because the threshold is not there. The threshold is at an energy level of consciousness. And when someone gets to that level, it becomes apparent, it becomes visible in differential openness that that threshold is somewhere specifically where someone is maintaining it. That the gate is only there because the gate watcher is there. Because the gate is everywhere in Tao, but only is somewhere because some Jin balanced is holding the Te open there. The gate is there because the gatekeeper is there. The gate itself is everywhere, the gateless gate, as Zen says. And sure, you're free to go anytime you want to. Any time that you want to, anywhere, at any particular moment. Can you do it? It's not so easy. It's easier for the super yogi to pass through the eye of the needle than to simply step over the gateless gate. It's very, very, very touchy. But as long as a gatekeeper is there maintaining the gate, the path exists to that gate and one can go. So in a junkyard of the pressure of ignorance, of like planet-wide bubble of ignorance, as long as someone maintains an escape valve, the thing is not going to explode. And even though it's infinitesimal, the explosive level is maintained below its critical stage. That's why gates exist in Te, and that's why gatekeepers keep working. But let's come back here. Let's fold ourselves back, fold our attention back, because you can see it gets intense. It gets white hot. There isn't anywhere that anyone has to be more important than where you are on scale of the real. Until that's settled, everything else is droodling. And no matter what you have accomplished or not accomplished, it's like writing in the sand. It's worse than that. But the simile, at least, is humane. It's worse than writing in the sand. It's like writing in the air. Doesn't even last to the next time. But let's do a deep visionary penetration here. We're using a metaphor of sand and water in writing. Sand, what element is sand? Silicon, right? Grains of silicon. And if you look at very old ancient sand, it's always in a crystalline structure. It's always silicon crystals. If you went to the Arabian Peninsula, to the central southern section of it, which is called the Empty Quarter, a friend of mine who worked for Amoco had himself coptered in, and he spent a night there just to have the experience. And he said it was truly devastating because it's absolutely empty. There is nothing but sand and sky, nothing. And it has not rained in that terrain for more than 1 million years. And that the sand crystals are so ultimately dry that just walking on them sends enough vibrational shock through them that static electricity crackles. And you can do real mystic war dance deep at night under the stars. Do you get it? To be anywhere else today but here, because this is happening now, is a sign that you didn't hear a thing. There's nobody dancing on that kind of static anywhere else. Whole planet. It's all empty on that level. Don't hear a single footstep. Don't hear one sizzle, one crackle. Now this crystalline structure of sand, vis-a-vis the openness of the sky, is a universal constant. It is, in fact, a scale, and it has a harmonic, and that harmonic is able to, through its consonants, have a resonance key, understandable, and the various notes expressible, so that one can learn that language. And one can speak the language of the universe, universal language, where you speak the universe's language, and the universe, being very conscious, responds, replies. That dialogue is worth having. That dialogue is the level where someone like Plato or Martin Buber tried to dig under the levels of veils of false language to get down to that dialogue. And the legs of that conversation always follow a binary, a paired binary movement. Because all you need initially, we said this 2 years ago, Nature 1 is going to be said again January 6th, 1996 at the Bodhi Tree at 10 o'clock in the morning. Pairedness is the deepest that we can go, because beyond that, one disappears forever. And any time that anything is going to move, the legs are going to be a binary of the movement and the stillness. That's the binary. That's the ultimate pair, the sand and the sky. And it's a universal constant that whenever there is movement, there's aggregation and that the most powerful aggregation is into crystalline structure. And when there is no movement whatsoever, there are not only no crystals, there's no matter, there's no aggregate, there's only openness. So that sand and sky are the ultimate yin-yang. Crystals and space are the ultimate legs upon which reality, when it wants to take a stroll, goes. When God wants to walk in his garden, he walks with crystals and space. Whoa, says Bill Murray in several films. It's profound. It's hushable scary. It's unbelievable. It's astounding. It's stunning. It is just basically, patently what is. Now, if one took oneself and became very large, suppose that the cells of my body were as large as this house. If the cells of my body were as large as this house, my body would reach from here to Saturn. And I would stand like a star system being, pretty large, not as completely big as the star system, but big enough that I could look around. And I could tilt my head up, and I could easily look over the orbits of Uranus and Neptune. And because Pluto's just a little nudge beyond Neptune's order now, I could look beyond Pluto very easily right now. And I could see out about as far as it is from the sun to Pluto, from Pluto out is a rim, a disk of rather interesting planetoid features. Somewhere between, a kilometer and 50 to 75 kilometers. Giant Manhattan-sized boulders. And there are billions of them. And the first man who ever gave a name to this kind of thing was a man named Gerald Kuiper. So it's called the Kuiper Belt. And every planetary system has a Kuiper Belt. It's a disk. Why is it a disk? Because dynamic movement condenses an aggregate eventually into a disk, into a spiral disk, as a matter of fact, initially. And beyond that disk, right at the very edge of the gravity which our star sends out, just before the gravity of our star becomes weak enough that the gravity of other stars begins to take over, right at that kind of weightless threshold between the stars, is a cloud of very fine particulate material. Another Dutchman, Kuiper was a Dutch, another Dutchman named Oort mathematically projected out that this was the Oort cloud. This is it's like, let's use geologic language for a second. You know, when a glacier cuts through a landscape and it picks up rocks and boulders and everything, and where the glacier moves and it stops and then starts to melt and recede, it deposits right at the edge what is called geologically a terminal moraine. A bunch of rocks and boulders and so forth. Well, the Oort cloud is the gravitational moraine of a stellar system. And if one was able to put on glasses being Saturn-sized and look beyond the Kuiper Belt and look beyond the Oort cloud, you would look into, for the first time, really deep space. Not outer space. Not forest space, but deepest space. And in that interstellar space, What's there? Openness and crystals. Yeah. Openness and crystals. What are the crystals in deep interstellar space? They are carbon atoms. Cosmic soot. You know? Fine grains of carbon. They have to be finer than 30 atoms, because if it's 30 atoms or more, the carbon atoms begin to make a crystal striation called graphite, and they form sheets. Not bed sheets, not paper sheets. Let's get the scale right. Molecular sheets. You'd need a pretty powerful instrument to see them, but they would be sheeted. But below 30 atoms, carbon has, I love the Canadian term for this kind of condition. It's called wonky. It means you don't know what to say. It's off kilter. It's, it doesn't have much style. It's wonky. So wonky grains of carbon are scattered by God's hand into interstellar space. What in God's name for? To clean it. It's just like the janitor, before he's going to sweep the floor, throws his sawdust down. Why does he throw the sawdust down? Why does this old tobacco-spitting, gray-bearded janitor throw the sawdust down before he sweeps? Because the junk, the little particulate junk, is going to cling to the sawdust, so when he sweeps, it'll sweep up very nice. Carbon soot, cosmic soot, is there in interstellar space so that God can keep it clean. The carbon soot is like the ants of interstellar space. They're always cleaning, always clean. How do they clean? Because as soon as there's any kind of a pressure, the carbon atoms tend to lump more, and the graphite sheets tend to lump, and as soon as the pressure gets to a certain level, gas pressure is measured on this planet in things called torrs, T-O-R-R. As soon as it gets above 100 torr, the lumping gets to be very effective. It's high enough pressure where the graphite sheets press into one another and become a new form of carbon called fullerenes. Little soccer ball. Instead of sheets, they become soccer balls. Fullerenes. And this clumping action, like the sawdust, draws any contaminants in interstellar space into that, so that space remains Tao. God loves that. Space remains Tao, and the Te does its stuff. That anything that is participating in movement comes together. Te is very, very tolerant. Anything that moves is included in the structure of matter. There's no prejudice. Te has no prejudice. It doesn't matter. The contaminant can be the most poisonous, radioactive gunk imaginable. Welcome. So that God keeps whole galactic structures clean. Oh, the interstellar space that we're talking about isn't very deep at all. It's sort of like just off the coast. It's still continental shelf because they're, most stars cluster together, and there are families of stars. Around our sun, there are about 30, 35 stars that make a family. And then outside these families is a little deeper water, a little deeper space. But even there, it's the carbon soot, less of it. because there's not many contaminants there. And when you get really large scale, when you get outside of galaxies, into intergalactic space, in between galaxies, there's not much carbon soot that's necessary because you don't have to sweep very often. God might there sweep once in forever. That's all he needs. And well, sort of Fred Astaire facial gestures. I hate to tell you this, but galaxies cluster together too. And you ought to see the dance that God can do outside of clusters of galaxies. I mean, he's going to sweep there, but just when is not quite definite because there's not much need. But there are also little carbon grains even there. So the carbon soot is the sand, and infinite space is the sky. And whenever there's anyone to move and do the dance, the electricity of vibration, energy, happens. And all of science, no matter how difficult, no matter how deep, no matter how advanced, revolves around this particular scenario. Let's take a break. Okay, we're looking forward to understanding then that science, like all of the other 8 sections, is actually a key. So that this whole education is an adventure in exploring a scale. The 2 years together are an octave of keys. An octave of keys. Each of the sections is a key. Nature was a key. Ritual was a key. Myth, symbols, vision, art, history, science. 8 keys which make a scale. So that this education as a whole process, very refined, not because of me, who said they stand on the shoulders of giants. Human wisdom on this planet is very refined. It goes much farther than aliens go. Much farther. So, this education as a scale, once one becomes acquainted with the 8 keys, with the octave of keys, you can then ratchet down and translate that within each key is also an octave. Within each of the 8 sections is also 8 steps, which are the notes, and each of the books that we take is actually a note. Now, there was a time just 2,000 years ago where a book was as much as consciousness could handle. Just 1 aeon ago, 1 double millennium ago, was as much as consciousness could hold. So that 2,000 years ago, a really sophisticated consciousness was able to master the book of life. Or a conscious people were people of the book. The Torah, the Testament, the Quran. Now, because of the Chinese, because their indexing quality was pentatonic, it was made pentatonic about 2,000 years ago. they mastered level of the book about 3,000 years before that. And it was brought to maturity about 3,000 years ago, about 1,000 years before the West. About 1000 BC, the Chinese I Ching became the book. But 1,000 years after that, 2,000 years ago, 0 BC, the Chinese penchant for a 5, a pentatonic scale, manifested itself in including the I Ching with 4 other books so that they became the 5 Confucian classics. And the 5 books became the basis of the Chinese civil service system, and it lasted until 1911, to our own time. In the West, we were people of the book, optimally. And now, in this particular educational cycle, we're using something like 60 books as a limiting form for operative consciousness, which is quite a step up. Quite a step. In modern technology, you're all familiar with the CD-ROM. CD-ROMs, though, even though they are enormously capable indexing key, are subject to a further grouping, a super grouping, a clustering, and one could put 60 CD-ROMs together. It's called a jukebox. When you have 60 CD-ROMs integrated together into a jukebox, you can control and project and integrate and differentiate an enormous scale of material, unbelievable scale of material. And you don't have to go beyond that form currently to really have a powerful tool. A jukebox of 60 CD-ROMs, really something. This education is like a jukebox of the highest consciousness available of 2,000 years ago. So we're stepping up. We're stepping up real big increment. It's like someone who 2,000 years ago could hum the notes in a key and now is able to use 8 keys and develop the whole scale. So that one can say that we have for the first time the practical working possibility of a full-scale human being. And that full-scale human being doesn't have to live on geographical junk shapes of dirt, but can be at home in a whole star system. That the whole star system is an appropriate home for such a scale of person. That's what this education is all about. Now, it's not going to be operative on street level until the middle of the 22nd century. It takes about 150 years for an idea to go from a single mind to everyday street level operative. But you don't have to wait until 2250, 2150. You can do it now. Now, in this particular symbolic expression of a scale, of key, of a note, each time you have 8 notes in a key and you have 8 keys. So how many notes are there in the scale? 8 times 8 is 64. How many hexagrams are there in the I Ching? 64. How many codons are there in DNA? 64. It's again one of those numbers, magic number. It's a juncture of many vectors. It's a seed point of a tensor that, as a locus of conscious threshold, is very, very important. 64 is an amazing number. Now let's fold back. Let's step back from this and let's consider something. Let's consider the building blocks of what we're talking about. The rule of thumb is that ultimately, if one were in a position of universal seeing, the binary of the material universe moves by crystal and space. The space doesn't have to move at all to be what it is. The crystal has to have movement to be what it is. So that stillness and movement also are a binary, are a pair. And while pairedness is a mystical envisioning of what it is, binary is an operative, meaningful application of what it does. So that when we talk about pairedness, we're talking about what it is, and when we're talking about binary, we're talking about what it can do. And as soon as you have a binary basis, you can develop that atomic structure into a complete language. When Leibniz repositioned mathematics along a binary scale of numerical patterning, one had calculus in a notational form for the first time in the history of this planet, with an asterisk on that. What is the asterisk? The asterisk is that calculus was developed some 700 years before Leibniz in Taoist monasteries, the White Cloud Monastery in the Western Hills outside of Beijing. But it was a meditational exercise technique and was never put into notation. And so when Joseph Needham was doing the great science and civilization in China, and went to the White Cloud Monastery and researched back into the archaic Chinese records, lo and behold, in engineering and mathematic texts from 700-800 years ago, discovered that they had developed the mental capacities and forms and motions that are calculus, but they developed no notation for it because they were interested in Tao and they were not interested in applied mathematics. For one thing, 700 or 800 years ago, you didn't want to mess with governmental powers, and certainly calculus puts to shame the organizing operative power structures that are. Political power structures simply dissolve into irrelevancy in face of a consciousness that's able to deal with a universal language like calculus. Politics is irrelevant. It's so low down on the level of applicable form organization, of grouping and aggregate, of sets, that it just is not worth talking about. So that the powers that are, which are all variants on some kind of political structure, certainly don't want to encourage a population of people who are able to see through them like cheesecloth. Then in China and now in the West. Because as soon as the calculus notation, actually they preferred Newton's for a while, his fluxions. It was very clumsy notation, that's why they preferred it. you had to go to Cambridge University and study under people that had learned it from Barrow and from Newton and so forth to be able to write the fluxion notation of calculus. And it was very cumbersome. And it was preferred because it limited it to certain upper class of English mindset. I'm omitting some words here. Because it was beginning to have a very unusual effect on English consciousness. What was the effect? That the generation before Newton's notation began to be known, you had poets like John Milton writing about heaven and hell, which was all right. Whereas the generation after Newton, you had poets like Wordsworth writing about mystical landscapes, which is not all right with political powers. As long as you keep people thinking about heaven and hell, you're going to be able to handle them with political cheesecloth. But as soon as that dissolves to where they have mystical relationalities with nature, you don't have to be outside of Tintern Abbey. You can be anywhere and have that Wordsworthian breath of fresh air. Those people are not handleable by political cheesecloth. They fall right through the strainer. You can't contain them. What's more, they pay no attention to you. They start utopian communities starting from scratch. So that whole development of consciousness became very suspect in the 18th century, the early 18th century. And so in order to make a distinction between things that were all right to deal with and things that were, it's not done, the English developed one of their words. The word was proper. You have to do things in a proper fashion. And proper means this and not that. And so a lot of constraints came in. And of course, when you constrain something that is a plasma, like conscious neural nets are, you get an explosive effect. And the first explosion out of that was the American Revolution. Because someone like Benjamin Franklin was not a very proper man. He didn't care a wig for the society. That's a play on words. He didn't give a fig. He didn't care a wig. He wore his hair natural. He was the savage American. And the French ladies liked him. And he liked them. It was a very paired relationship, believe me. A lot of symbiosis going on, which is better than synchronicity. You get harmonics that are very interesting. Notice here that the material that we have very easily pushes its way into a level of discourse that is applicable anywhere in the world, anything that you want to concern yourself with. It doesn't take very long at all to jump and step into any application that you want whatsoever. This educational experience is universally applicable. You can go into anything that you want to go into. It doesn't make any difference. But part of the binary that works here are the pairs of books. And the fact that we have a jukebox of all these books that we use together gives it a very powerful form. Powerful enough that one could comprehend any aspect of civilization on this planet up to 2,000 years into the future. Anything back all the way to millions of years ago, up till about 2,000 years in the future. It'll be applicable in the year 4000, all up close to it. its stress, its tensile stress limitations on comprehension will run out about that time. And somebody else is going to have to go to work. They have to roll up their sleeves and make all the goddamn sacrifices and just tow it out and learn again the simple old truth that somebody has to stay behind the plow to get those furrows done, and that's the only way seeds get planted. There just is no other way to do it. The pairs of books are philosophic vision of what it is, but the binary dynamic and energy of the books together is the way in which it works. Remember, I talked about the legs on which this course moves are the pairs of books. Now, coming up at the end of science, the last pair of books is Molecular Biology of the Cell, and we're using Richard Feynman's, the biography of Richard Feynman, The Beat of a Different Drum. It's available in paperback. And we're using this pair of books at the end of science. Now, this pair of books is right at the end of science. It's the last pair of 3. The pair before this is The Conscious Universe, Phados, and Kip Thorne's book on black holes and time warps, which is also in paperback. And before this pair, we have Niels Bohr's Times by Abraham Pais and Mary Leakey's book on disclosing the past. Let's count them by pairs. 1 pair, 2 pairs, 3 pairs. 3 times 2 is 6. Okay, every section had 12 weeks that took 6 books, but there's an octave, right? There's an octave, so it's got to be 8. Oh yes, there's always a book for the interval. Every section has an interval. What's the book for the interval for science? The Bhagavad Gita. So that's 2, 4, 6, 7. Well, wait a minute, it's only 7. Where is the 8th book? Let's hum the notes of a key. I can't hum too well, so let me just speak them. It's a new kind of an octave. It's a mono octave. The stereoscopic teacher just folded, right? He's a mono teacher. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. What's the 8th note? Do. Well, didn't we begin with do? Yes. So at the 8th note is also the same as the beginning note, except that it is now at the threshold of a new key. So at the 8th note, the 8th book is always then the first book in the next section. So that the sections are not aggregates like bricks, but they're grouped in such a way that they're on a sinuous, continuous spiral, so that the 8th book of this section is already the first book of the next. So it's a continuous rolled process that has no seam. You've heard of seamless garments? 2,000 years ago, Jesus talked about the seamless garment of light in certain esoteric texts. That when man's soul is freed from its imprisonment, one wears the robe of glory, the seamless robe of light. And that the flap of that cape takes in everything in the universe that we could possibly see. That same garment. So that the reductive ignorance that puts us down into some kind of junky, misshapen wonky, stupid person is an astronomically reductive lie that every single one of us wears the universe. It's just simply the garment of light of our person. How can all of us wear the same universe? Well, in God's home, that's very easy to do. It's no big thing. So that the ignorance that has been operating on this planet is catastrophic. It's not just stupid. It's not just dumb. It's catastrophically ignorant. It's amazingly dumb. It is reductive to the point of absurdity. Now, in order to break that hypnotic veil, when it is a veil, it's called Maya, and when the veil shimmers, it's called samsara. The veil that hides Tao is Maya. The veil that scrambles Te is samsara. In order to penetrate through, to puncture that particular illusion, all one needs is an initial insight, a single note. Single note will do it. That the structure of deceit is so fragile, it's so brittle, it's so provisionally tinker-toyed that one single breath in a insightful way is enough to poke through. So you don't need a karate chop. You don't need 5 million years of yoga to get one single enlightenment push. But in order to frame where you're going to touch with your finger, because that's all you have to do, not even with your finger, just with your look. In order to frame where your look is, takes about 2 years. I can't refine it any more than that. Somebody else will. They'll come along. Somebody will come along with 5-minute therapy sections 300 years from now and just say, well, 2 years. Can't even get in a game of golf. They'll do it. But I can't. I can get it to where in 2 years you can get to where you can position, and if you want to, you can make your own freedom. But it needs to participate in a continuously rolled 2-year form, and that's hard to do. That's what's hard to do. Making the penetration doesn't take strength at all. It doesn't take genius. It doesn't. Bhakti, right? But to be able to conscientiously, and it takes some courage too, to position yourself to just do it continuously, that is very, very difficult. And Los Angeles is the most difficult place on the planet to do it. If it can be done here, it can be done anywhere, because there are more distractions in Los Angeles than any other place on the planet. There are distractions on every conceivable level, every facet of every level. Now let's come back to sand and sky. Let's come back to stars like grains of sand. Isaac Asimov had one of his Eternity series novels called The Stars Like Dust. That when you look out into the universe, when you look out into the cosmos, what you see is cosmic dust. You see stars like dust. And if you could look finer and finer and finer, you would see that in between the stars, actually, one comes across these soot crystal particles of carbon. And under certain pressure. Now, how does there get to be pressure in interstellar space? much less intergalactic space. Pressure comes as a shock wave. Whenever a star goes supernova, for instance, or just nova, whenever a star, and all stars in their lifespan includes a nova crisis threshold, whenever a star goes nova, it sends out a shock wave that goes through the interstellar medium. So it's like this vast, enormous, refined velvet pudding that gets a quiver every time a star smiles. A nova is like a smile. It's not a big thing. It's a wonderful thing. Because stars in this way return back to God, fully paid, the account of energy that they incurred by being made. Because the birth of the star was the crystallization of matter into an implosion, nuclear fusion that is the star, and its nova returns back that energy in the form of shock waves that then help condense the interstellar materia into clumps that eventually are able to be gravitationally brought together to be able to form the basis, the root, the soil out of which the stars will be made again. So it's an ecology, understand? It's an ecology. Cosmic soot and space are a binary, they're a pair. They're a pair, mystically, but they're a binary, mathematically, and this is the way in which reality happens. Otherwise, there would be nothing here. Nothing whatsoever. Less than nothing. Because nothingness itself is binary with anything, with something. So the shock waves going through are like a meeting of two vectors, a vector of sky and a vector of sand, a vector of openness and a vector of integral. And when they come together, that resultant is a creative energy. And one can put a little bit of author's message here. Remember Woody Allen's first screenplay, What's New, Pussycat? And Peter O'Toole got to the certain place with Romney Schneider, and he's talking, and this little thing blinks out, says author's message. Nice little scroll. Tink, tink, tink. Author's message. Not my message. I'm just delivering it. God's message is that energy is the tensor by which the real sustains its actuality. That's why energy and matter are so important, but they're not just important energy and matter, but that matter as the crystal and openness as the space. And now we're going to use a term that unfortunately has been somewhat smeared by the political cheesecloth, but is a very good term: freedom. That the universe works in such a way that stuff and freedom together quiver as energy, and that energy then allows for the ecology to be fueled, and so that it operates, it works. In this energy pattern, not only matter and energy, but also freedom, in this tapestry, in this fabric of energy, matter, and freedom, any node, any nodule, any focus that embodies all three together becomes a pivot upon which the whole universe turns. This is why when someone raises up to scientific consciousness, raises the differential capacity to scientific consciousness and looks at the dance of matter and energy, they participate, their viewing of it participates with it and changes it. This is why there's such a thing as the uncertainty principle. This is why when you have photons and a metal plate and two little pinholes in it, when you're looking at the experiment, you can always have a predictive formula for which of the pinholes it's going to go through, because each time a photon goes through one of the little pinholes, it sends out little waves, and the two little pinholes send out waves that intersperse and make an interference pattern. And that interference pattern is different when you're looking at it and when you're not. When the observer is observing it, it has a predictable, variable form, and when you're not, it isn't very predictable. One can deal with very accurate measurement. In the one case, one has to deal at best with approximate probability in the other. And that there's no way to refine it, to hone it, so that both those cases overlap completely and are contiguous. They're always off a little bit to the space, to the measure of the observer. So that a scientific consciousness, a differential consciousness, together enough to know what it's observing, participates in the event. Not only in that event of this experiment with photons, but in the event that is the universe. No matter how many notes and keys and scales you have, if one note is off, that whole key is off, that whole scale is off. And instead of having a possibility of a harmonic, one then has noise. This is why no hot rodders are allowed in heaven. One sour note, not equivalent hot rodders with a sour note. I'm sorry about that. Don Garlett's my apologies. But the whole metaphor here is that if you want to have paradise, then earn it by living it. Be paradisical in yourself. And you don't have to go anywhere to be in paradise. You will be there. That's the guarantee. And that the guarantee is in writing. How is it written? It's written every time matter and energy and consciousness come together. Every focus of it, anywhere in the universe, is the dotted line. It's there every single time. You don't have to have a lawyer. But you have to show up. And if you show up, the conditions will come together. This means that if we look at cosmic soot in space, we have a wonderful metaphor for understanding how reality happens. And cosmic soot is carbon atoms, carbon grains. And it turns out that carbon as an element is detectable by an absorption quantity of light, electromagnetic energy, light, and that the absorption wavelength of carbon is about 217 nanometers. That's meters gone down to about billion times. 217 nanometers. That means that that light is over on the ultraviolet edge of light, of electromagnetic energy. So that when somebody has a machine called a spectrograph that is able to record and digitally note quite exactly what the spectrum is of given light source, at 217 nanometers, carbon always shows up. There's a little bit of a spike there, and that's carbon is right there. When there is a shock wave that goes through the universe, the cosmic soot, exposed to at least 100 torr of pressure, which is not that much. In nova, you get really dense pressures, so that the spike becomes very noticeable, except that it isn't just one spike. When the gas pressure in interstellar space is above 100 torr, for whatever reason, suppose some future astronaut who's in interstellar space claps his hands and produces over 100 torr of pressure right there in that localized space. That pressure is enough to send carbon atoms that have already aggregated to little sheets of graphite, microscopic atomic sheets of graphite, send them imploding so that they implode at enough pressure to make a new form of carbon, the fullerenes, carbon-60 and beyond. So that instead of getting sheeting of carbon, you get soccer balls of carbon, 60 atoms of carbon minimally together. C60 it's called. Mixed in with it is a little bit even higher called C70. And if one could refine, one would get up to C260 or C520. So that you get these forms of matter. Yes, they are the element carbon, but they're exotic forms of it. They're exotic in one sense, but they're also universal in another, because every time you get this kind of buckyball fullerene, C60 in interstellar space, certain qualities of handling energy are stepped up in the scale of energy matter interfacing, vector coming together, and you get new possibilities. They're like little factories that make new forms, new material forms possible, interesting forms possible. What is the upshot of it? It's a trigger by which the universe begins to diversify the possible building blocks that are used then to make very, very interesting forms of matter. We're one of the interesting forms of carbon-based matter. Our structure is a fantastic differential ballet on cosmic soot. How fantastic? Because we can show a photograph of our mother. This is a family picture. This is my mother. I don't know what Bill Murray would say, but you can imagine. It's like Groundhog Day. You can't go into the future until, through an act of insight, of loving the universe like this, as your mother, that you get freed from the dull round of having to repeat the same day over and over again, indefinitely, until you're freed. It's a Los Angeles fairy tale, that kind of thing, till you're freed to go. When are you freed to go? Just a simple act of love, of respect towards our mother, And that every night we're able to see the sand of the cosmos. And in between all that sand is an even finer sand, the carbon soot, the seeds of ourselves. Now, science on this scale, is not approachable by the in-place standard educational models. None of the education that's working, operative today, that you're paying for, that you're expecting is going to work, that are giving degrees, take you here. None of them. You can try it. I tried it. I spent a long time. 9 years as a student and 10 years as a professor. One more year, I'd had a pension as a perennial universityite. And the pension would have been worth nothing. They don't pay you. The payoff is, can you be free in your reality and live it? That's a real payoff. And in that payoff, at that cash window, this education has a lot of benefits. Now let's come back. Let's fold back. Let's come back. Every element shows up on a spectrograph. Carbon shows up at 217 nanometers in the ultraviolet, the UV. You hear on the radio the UV index, you're going to get sunburn. Well, 217 nm is, you don't want to get exposed too much to that. You want to thank the planet to have this beautiful bluish atmosphere that screens out the UV so that the powers of God's creation are searing. That's why the devil goes into hell, to get away from the searing beauty of heaven. Has to hide. And hides in the only covering that there is, the covering of the umbrella of samsara. And under that umbrella of deceit, you find all the demons that there are, and outside of that there aren't any. There are no nightmares, except under the umbrellas of deceit. Because the searing energy of God's creative energy just simply dismantles them. Demons get sunburned in about 1/trillionth of a second. A lot of zeros. They never show their face to the sun. It's worse than Dracula. Well, to get the end of the lecture, you have to come back next week.